Hello guys, it's Dan here. I thought I'd talk today in a bit more depth than I have in the past about what recommendations I would make for a reading order for Tolkien, but focusing particularly on material relevant to The Lord of the Rings on Amazon Prime. Let me just begin with a quick reminder to please like the video, and if you're new to Voice of Geekdom, please consider subscribing and clicking the bell icon button to get notified of all my future uploads. Right now on this channel, I am covering the works of Tolkien exclusively, but I have big plans for covering other great works of high fantasy and science fiction in the future. Every now and then, I see the question of reading order coming up with relation to Tolkien. There really isn't a definitive answer to this question, and it depends on what you're hoping to get out of your read-through. But I hope I can at least shed a little light on what these various titles are, and what to expect out of reading them. I would recommend for most people, most of the time, to begin reading Tolkien with The Lord of the Rings. It is Tolkien's most complete, cohesive and accessible narrative. The magnum opus, if you will. Everyone watching this will know the basic outline of the story already, so it really doesn't bear over-explaining, but I will just say two things on this. Firstly, watching the Peter Jackson movies, as excellent as they are in many ways, is not a substitution for reading the book. As someone who had read The Lord of the Rings many times before the movies ever came out, I can appreciate that I have a different perspective on this to many people who are of my generation or younger, but there really is nothing like The Lord of the Rings experienced on the page. My second piece of advice here, and not for the last time, relates to the forthcoming Amazon Prime series. This show is going to be set in the Second Age of Middle-earth, which ended 3,000 years before the events of The Hobbit and The Lord of the Rings. If you're reading and rereading Tolkien because you would like to be prepared for when the TV show debuts, which is exactly what I started doing about 18 months ago now, my advice to you is this. Make sure you read the appendices of The Lord of the Rings thoroughly. Pay particular attention to Appendix A, which gives more information on the Númenórean kings, which is most crucial, and also to Appendix B, which gives a rough timeline for the Second and Third Ages. The Amazon Prime series will be set in the Second Age. Now, some will recommend reading The Hobbit first, before The Lord of the Rings, and there is a certain logic to this. The Lord of the Rings is the sequel to The Hobbit, of course, and there is no particular reason not to read them chronologically. But I would still start with The Lord of the Rings if I was giving advice to someone that had never read any of the books before, just purely because it is the biggest and best piece of fiction that Tolkien ever wrote, and it is the connecting piece of the Middle-earth picture, which joins us back to the Elder Days, which are explained in the Silmarillion. Your mileage may vary. If you're a parent, and you're looking for something to read with a child, I would definitely recommend The Hobbit first, and then move on to The Lord of the Rings when the time is right. If you are indeed simply reading material relating to the Amazon Prime series, then you may even wish to skip The Hobbit entirely. Although I personally wouldn't, as the series has ample reason to feature the dwarves, who were involved too in the story of the forging of the Rings of Power, and were given 7 rings themselves. Either way, once you are ready to move on, then I might be inclined to recommend taking a short detour outside of Middle-earth to cover some of the other important works of the Professor. There is a volume called Tree and Leaf, which was first published in 1964. Tree and Leaf collects Tolkien's seminal essay on fairy stories, and the allegorical short story Leaf by Niggle. Editions published after 1988 also feature the poem Mythopoeia, which was a piece of poetic apologetics on the value of myths and myth-making, which was addressed to his friend and fellow Inkling, C.S. Lewis. On Fairy Stories is where we find Tolkien's perspective on myth-making, most clearly explained and justified, though, and it is essential reading for those seeking to understand these works academically. Leaf by Niggle is an allegory about a painter called Niggle, which is a highly revealing allegory about Tolkien's perspective on the sub-creative experience and his own life's works. If you would like me to cover these two important works on the channel, let me know in the comments. I suggest On Fairy Stories and Leaf by Niggle, although they could be considered optional because they inform the reader on many of the ideas that went into the next item on our list, the Silmarillion. The Silmarillion is one version of the set of stories that Tolkien spent his entire life writing and revising, and which worked their way into the stories of The Hobbit, and to a much larger extent The Lord of the Rings, as the mythical backdrop for the stories of Bilbo and Frodo. The Silmarillion, which was published in 1977, 4 years after Tolkien died, is the reason for the feeling of richness within the world of The Lord of the Rings. The main part of the Silmarillion is the Quenta Silmarillion, the history of the Silmarils, which we have been covering over in my Silmarillion Explained series, which is really the history of the Elder Days and the First Age of the Sun up until the overthrow of Morgoth, who was Sauron's old boss. As far as potential Amazon Prime content goes here, pay close attention to the 4th and 5th sections of the Silmarillion though. The Akalabeth, which is an Adunaic word which means the downfallen, deals with the rise and fall of the island state of Númenor, which precedes the kingdoms of Arnor and Gondor in The Lord of the Rings, and which has been more or less confirmed to appear in the Amazon Prime show. Adunaic is the language of Númenor. The 5th and final section of the Silmarillion deals with the forging of the Rings of Power in the Second Age, before giving a synopsis of the Third Age and the events of the War of the Ring. Given that the Amazon show seems to be following familiar characters who were present in the Second Age, like Galadriel and Elrond, it is highly likely that we will see an adaptation of the story of the Forging of the Rings in Eregion by the Noldor smith Celebrimbor. We don't know how directly the television show will adapt this material, but it is certain to be a contributing source to the writing staff, and many of the cast have shared photographs of themselves reading the Silmarillion on social media. After the Silmarillion, the next title I would recommend for those looking for material relevant to the Amazon show would be Unfinished Tales, or to give it its full title, Unfinished Tales of Númenor and Middle-earth. As the name suggests, there is a good amount of supplemental material in here about Númenor and the Men of the West. The book is actually split into 4 parts. The first part contains unfinished longer versions of the stories of The Children of Húrin and The Fall of Gondolin, which, in their shorter forms, make up 2 of the later chapters of the Quenta Silmarillion, and have since been released in standalone form, but we'll get to those standalones in a moment. The second part to Unfinished Tales is where the Númenor material is, starting with the only map of the island which Tolkien ever drew. The map of Numenor, which Amazon released on all of their social media accounts, was based upon this map in Unfinished Tales. Then follows an account of the geography of Numenor to accompany and contextualize the map. And then we get the tale of Aldarion and Erendis, also called the Mariner's Wife. This one is sadly half finished, and with Christopher Tolkien suggesting a possible ending based upon his father's notes. Tar Aldarion was the 6th king of Numenor, and the first to widely explore the lands of Middle-earth. This was the story of his marriage to Erendis, and their later estrangement. Part 2 of Unfinished Tales concludes with an account of the line of Elros. That's the line of the kings of Numenor, giving a little more detail in some places than Appendix A of The Lord of the Rings. The final 2 sections of Unfinished Tales contain additional background material relating to the stories of The Hobbit and The Lord of the Rings, including background info on the wizards, Galadriel's history, the Palantiri, that's the Seeing Stones of Numenor, and many other story elements. Of these various sections, the history of Galadriel and Celeborn is the one most likely to feature potential Amazon Prime story material, as this chapter closely concerns their movements during the Second Age and into the Third. And with Morvith Clark signed up to play the famous Noldorin Elf Queen, we know that Galadriel is a character whom we will see in the show. After Unfinished Tales, first-time readers should certainly look at reading the 3 Great Tales, the volumes covering the stories of Beren and Luthien, the children of Húrin, and the fall of Gondolin. Of the 3, the children of Húrin is the most complete and cohesive. I have often argued for reading the Children of Húrin in lieu of reading the Of Turin Turambar chapter in the Silmarillion, as it fleshes out that particular tale and gives life to the characters that the short version lacks. But this is a matter of personal taste. Beren and Luthien and the Fall of Gondolin are more fractured volumes and consist of excerpts from various versions of those stories, including the early Book of Lost Tales versions, and in the case of Beren and Luthien, the epic poem The Lay of Leithien, which Tolkien wrote between 1925 and 1931. The final major piece of Tolkien's legendarium is the History of Middle-earth series, a 12-volume series edited by Christopher Tolkien, which covers a vast array of previously unpublished material relating to both the Silmarillion and the Lord of the Rings. Some of the highlights are the Book of Lost Tales, which is like the original first version of the Silmarillion, the Lays of Beleriand, which contains some of Tolkien's epic verse, and Morgoth's Ring, which features some of Tolkien's fascinating later writings, which revolved around his attempts to revise the Silmarillion mythology, largely in order that it would work with The Lord of the Rings when published. Some final works include The Adventures of Tom Bombadil, which was a collection of Middle-earth poetry published during Tolkien's lifetime, and The Letters of J.R.R. Tolkien, which was published by his biographer Humphrey Carpenter with the assistance of Christopher. So there you have it, my rundown of the Middle-earth core texts. There are still many other works by Tolkien not set in Middle-earth, and a lot of other third-party literature to be read on Middle-earth, and on The Professor. What is your favourite work by Tolkien? Let me know in the comments below, and once more, don't forget to like the video.